The moment Mabel Crowley opened her mouth, the whole train platform went quiet. She didn't shout. She didn't need to. Her voice carried the particular cruelty of a woman who had spent decades perfecting the art of public humiliation. And when she looked at the wooden wheelchair being lifted down from the passenger car, she turned to the crowd around her and said, loudly enough for everyone to hear, "Well, Wyatt Callahan ordered himself a wife and got himself a charity case instead." Laughter. Not from everyone, but enough. The woman in the chair sat perfectly still through all of it. Her name was Eleanor Voss, or that was the name she had given in her letters. And she had traveled 4 days by rail from Pennsylvania to reach a town she had never seen, to meet a man she had never touched, to build a life she wasn't entirely sure she deserved. She had known this moment would come. She had rehearsed for it during every mile of track that clicked beneath her. She had told herself she was ready. She had been wrong. If you've ever stood in a place where everyone around you has already decided what you are, before you've spoken a word, before you've proven a single thing, then you already know what Eleanor felt in those first 30 seconds on that platform. And if you haven't, count yourself fortunate. This is her story. And it doesn't end the way anyone in Red Hollow expected. If this is your first time here, please subscribe and hit the like button so you don't miss what comes next. Because this story is going to take you somewhere you didn't see coming. Drop a comment with your city or country while you're at it. I want to see how far this one travels. The train had been late by nearly 2 hours, which meant the crowd on the platform had grown larger than it would have otherwise. People who had finished their errands and meant to go home had stayed. A delay on the Northern Pacific Line was rare enough to be interesting, and interesting things didn't happen often in Red Hollow, Montana, in the spring of 1880. Wyatt Callahan had arrived early. He always did. It was a habit left over from a decade of ranching, where the difference between early and late was sometimes the difference between saving a calf and losing it. He had stood near the far end of the platform with his hat in his hands and his stomach doing something he hadn't felt in long enough that he'd almost forgotten the feeling. Nerves. Pure, uncomplicated nerves. He was 41 years old. He had run the Callahan spread alone for 3 years, ever since Clara died. He had raised 2 children through that. Noah, who was 14 now, and had gone mostly quiet since the funeral, and Lily, who was 9 and still cried sometimes at night without quite knowing why. He had kept the cattle alive through 2 brutal winters. He had fixed the fences and paid the debts, and done every single thing that needed doing, and there had been nobody to help him do any of it. He wasn't a man who asked for help easily. Sending away for a bride had cost him something. He wasn't sure yet what to call it. Her letters had been good. Better than good, if he was honest. Eleanor Voss had written with a directness that surprised him. No flattery, no performance. She had told him plainly what she could do and what she couldn't. She had said she was 32, that she had grown up in a wealthy family in Philadelphia, that she was educated and had run a household and had no patience for being treated like a decoration. She had said she wanted a real life, whatever that meant, and that she was willing to work for it. She had not described herself as beautiful. She had not described herself much at all beyond what was functional. He had liked that about her. He had written back and told her to come. What she had not told him was anything about the wheelchair. He saw it first, before he saw her. The porter was struggling with it at the top of the car's steps. A wooden chair with iron wheels, solid and clearly well used, the kind of thing that announced its purpose before anything else did. Wyatt's mind went blank for a moment. He watched the porter set the chair down at the bottom of the steps, and then turned to assist someone descending carefully from the car. Eleanor came down the steps one at a time, both hands on the railing, and when she reached the platform, she turned and lowered herself into the chair with the efficiency of someone who had done this 10,000 times. She straightened her coat. She looked up. That was when Mabel Crowley said what she said. Eleanor's eyes found Wyatt across the platform. She didn't look away. She didn't look down. She sat in that chair with her spine straight and her chin level and her expression entirely unreadable, and she watched him the way a person watches a weather system coming in from the west, waiting to see what it would do. Wyatt stood there for 3 full seconds that felt like considerably longer. The crowd was watching him. That was the thing about small towns. Everyone was always watching, and they were watching now. Mabel Crowley, with her hand over her mouth and a smug satisfaction behind her eyes. The men from the feed store who had wandered over to see what the fuss was. A handful of women who were exchanging glances that communicated entire conversations without a single word. They were waiting to see what Wyatt Callahan would do with the woman in the wheelchair. He put his hat back on his head and walked across the platform. Eleanor watched him come. She didn't smile, didn't offer him anything that could be read as either apology or plea. When he stopped in front of her, she said, "Mr. Callahan." Her voice was steady, completely steady. "Miss Voss," he said. A pause. Neither of them filled it immediately. "I owe you an explanation," she said finally. "I know that, and I intend to give you one, but I'd prefer to do it somewhere that isn't—" She didn't look at Mabel Crowley, but there was a slight angle to her head that acknowledged the woman's existence. Here. Wyatt looked at her for another moment. Then he picked up the small traveling case that the porter had set beside her chair and said, "My wagon's at the end of the street." That was all he said. He heard Mabel Crowley behind them as he walked. Something about charity cases and burdens and what kind of man makes his children live with a cripple. He didn't stop. He didn't turn around. But he heard Eleanor just behind him as he pushed through the edge of the crowd, draw a breath through her nose that was sharp enough that he knew she had heard it too. The wagon ride to the ranch was 40 minutes on a good road and closer to an hour on the rutted track that connected Red Hollow to the Callahan spread. It was not a good road. Eleanor sat beside him on the wagon bench. She had managed the step up herself, refusing the hand he offered without making a production of the refusal. And for the first several minutes, neither of them said anything. The landscape opened up around them, the kind of enormous Montana sky that either made a person feel free or made them feel very small, and Wyatt let the horse find its pace. He was thinking. He was good at thinking without looking like he was doing it, which his children found maddening, and which Clara had once called his most annoying habit and his most useful one at the same time. He was thinking about the letters, about the months of correspondence that had led to this wagon ride, about the fact that the woman beside him had written to him for 6 months and had never once mentioned the wheelchair, and about all the possible reasons a person might omit something like that. "You want to know why I didn't tell you?" Eleanor said. It wasn't a question. He looked at her. "I want to hear what you decide to say about it," he said. "There's a difference." She considered that. Fair enough. She straightened the hem of her coat against her knee. "I didn't tell you because I needed you to see what I could offer first, before you saw what I couldn't. If I had told you in the first letter, you never would have written back. Or if you had, you'd have spent every letter after that looking for reasons to feel better about rejecting me. People do that." She said this without bitterness, just as plain fact. They convince themselves they're being kind. "How long have you been in the chair?" he asked. "Since I was 24. There was a carriage accident. My spine was damaged. Not completely, but enough. I can stand for short periods. I can walk a few steps if I have something to hold. But for anything that requires distance or time, I need the chair." She paused. "It isn't going to improve. I've seen enough doctors to know." "I didn't ask if it was going to improve," Wyatt said. She looked at him again. There was something in her expression that shifted slightly. Not surprise exactly, but the near cousin of it. "What I asked," he continued, "is how long you've been managing it." 8 years, she said. 8 years was a long time to manage anything. He let that settle. "The household work," he said. "You wrote that you could manage it." "I can. My family had servants after the accident. I refused most of their help because I refused to spend 8 years sitting in a room being taken care of. I've learned what I can do and how to do it differently." She kept her eyes on the road ahead. "I won't be able to haul water from the well or chase after cattle. I know that. But I can cook, I can keep accounts, I can teach the children. I'm better at most of those things than someone who spent their energy standing up." There was an edge in that last sentence, a small one, but it was there. Wyatt said nothing for a moment. Then, "My daughter Lily is 9. She's been without a mother for 3 years. She has her moments." "What kind of moments?" "Crying at things that seem small, being afraid of things she won't name, needing someone who isn't her father to talk to." He paused. "I can't give her that." Eleanor was quiet. Then she said, "And the boy?" "Noah's 14. He blames himself for his mother's death. Clara died in the winter. She went out to find him when he'd been gone too long, and the weather came in fast. He thinks if he'd been where he was supposed to be, she would still be here." Eleanor made a sound that wasn't quite a word. Is that what happened? She asked. No, Wyatt said. She would have gone out regardless. She always went out when one of them was missing too long. It's who she was. But he's 14 and 14-year-olds don't respond well to logic when they're carrying guilt. No, Eleanor agreed. They don't. They rode the rest of the way in something that wasn't quite comfortable silence, but was at least honest quiet. The Callahan ranch came into view as the wagon crested a low hill. The main house, 2 outbuildings, a barn, fencing that ran in several directions across the pasture. It looked like a place that had been well built and then somewhat neglected, the kind of place where the important things had been held together, but the smaller details had fallen away in the press of necessity. Eleanor looked at it for a long time before she said anything. It's a good location, she said finally. Good wind protection from the north. My father chose it, Wyatt said. He knew what he was looking at. They came to a stop in front of the house. Wyatt set the brake and climbed down, then turned to help Eleanor with the chair, which had been secured in the wagon bed. He was trying to work out the mechanics of it, how she managed the transition from bench to ground to chair, when she said, I'll show you how. It's faster if you know. So she showed him. It took less time than he expected. Lily appeared in the doorway of the house while they were doing it. She stood there in her pinafore with her hair half escaped from its braid and stared at Eleanor in the chair. Children in that era had not been taught to hide their curiosity, and so she didn't. Your chair has got big wheels, Lily said. They have to be, Eleanor said, looking up at her. For getting around outside. Regular wheels get stuck in the mud. Lily processed this with the focused seriousness of a 9-year-old encountering new information. Does it go fast? On a good surface, fairly. But your lane needs some work if I'm going to get any speed up. Lily's expression shifted into something that was almost a smile before she seemed to catch herself. She looked at her father, then back at Eleanor. Papa said you were coming to stay. That's what we're figuring out, Eleanor said. Is that all right with you? Lily thought about it. I don't know yet, she said, with the brutal honesty of childhood. But you can come in. Yeah. Noah was not in the house. Wyatt said he was probably out at the north fence line, that he'd come back when the work was done, and said it in a way that suggested this was both true and not the complete picture. Eleanor filed it away. The inside of the house was clean in the functional sense. Dishes put away, floor swept, nothing rotting in a corner. But it was bare in a way that made Eleanor's chest do something unexpected. There were no curtains. There were no photographs on the walls except one, a small daguerreotype on the mantelpiece that showed a woman with dark hair and serious eyes who had to be Clara. There was a child's drawing pinned near the window that had partially come loose and hung at an angle that nobody had bothered to fix. Eleanor fixed it while Wyatt was bringing in her trunk. She had to ask Lily for a second pin because the first one wasn't holding, and Lily brought it without being asked twice, which told Eleanor something useful. Who drew that? Eleanor asked. Noah, Lily said. When he was little, Mama used to always hang it up, and he used to say it was embarrassing, but I think he liked it. Papa kept it after. Eleanor looked at the drawing. 2 stick figures and a house and a sun with too many rays. The kind of drawing that existed in every house that had ever held a happy child. It's a good drawing, Eleanor said. It's not really, Lily said, but we keep it anyway. This was, without Eleanor fully understanding why, exactly the right thing to say. Something in her loosened slightly. Wyatt came back in with the trunk and set it in the room off the main hall that he'd indicated would be Eleanor's. A small room, plainly furnished, with a window that looked south toward the barn. Eleanor moved through the doorway and looked at the space and thought that she had lived in rooms 4 times this size that had felt far smaller. I'll get supper started, he said, heading for the kitchen. I can do it, Eleanor said. He stopped, turned. There was something careful in his expression. You don't have to, Mr. Callahan. She kept her voice even. If I am going to be of any use here, we need to establish now that you don't have to walk on glass around me. I am going to do things. Sometimes I'll need to ask you to reach something on a high shelf or carry something heavy. That is not going to injure my dignity. What injures my dignity is being offered the chair by the fire every time something needs doing. A silence. All right, he said. Tell me where things are. He told her. She got the supper started. It wasn't graceful. Navigating a kitchen she didn't know from a chair required more trial and error than she would have preferred, and she knocked over a jar of dried beans, reaching for something behind it, and had to chase them across the floor, which she did without comment. And Lily, who had been watching from the doorway, came in without being asked and helped gather them. Wyatt stayed out of the kitchen. She appreciated that more than she said. Noah came in when the light had gone mostly orange and the food was nearly ready. He was tall for 14 with his father's coloring and his mother's sharp eyes, and he stopped in the doorway of the kitchen and stared at Eleanor the way his sister had stared at the chair, openly, without pretense. Eleanor looked up from the stove. "You must be Noah." He didn't answer that. He said, "Why are you in our kitchen?" "I'm making supper." "My father makes supper." "Then tonight you get a change of pace," Eleanor said. He stared at her a moment longer. Then he went to wash his hands without another word, which was not warmth exactly, but was at least compliance. They ate together at the table, all four of them, and it was strange and awkward and nothing like a family, and also not as bad as it might have been. Lily talked. She had opinions about everything and stated them clearly, which Eleanor found refreshing. Noah ate with his eyes on his plate and answered direct questions in the fewest words possible. Wyatt ate and occasionally asked a practical question about the crossing or the weather in Pennsylvania or whether she needed anything for her room. After supper, when the children had gone to their rooms and Wyatt was at the table with the ranch ledgers, Eleanor came to the doorway. "I'd like to look at those," she said, "if you don't mind." He looked up. "The accounts?" "I managed my family's household accounts for 4 years. I'm good with numbers." She paused. "And from what I saw during supper, that lamp oil is going fast, the salt crock is down to the last third, and someone needs to sharpen the good kitchen knife before it becomes more dangerous to the cook than to anything she's cutting. I'd like to see where you're spending and where you might trim." Wyatt looked at her for a moment. Then he pushed the ledger across the table toward the empty chair beside him. Eleanor moved into the room and sat beside him, and they bent over the numbers together in the lamplight. And it was not romantic in any sense that the word usually implies, but it was something. The beginning of something, though neither of them would have named it yet. Outside, the Montana night settled around the house. The wind came down from the mountains the way it always did. The cattle shifted in the pasture. Nobody in Red Hollow would have believed it, but the Callahan ranch was, very quietly, beginning to change. The ledger told a harder story than Wyatt had let on. Eleanor had seen enough household accounts to know when numbers were being managed versus when they were genuinely tight, and the Callahan spread was genuinely tight. Not failing, the cattle operation was sound and the land was good, but running on margins that left almost no room for a bad season, a sick animal, or an unexpected repair. She worked through the columns while Wyatt sat across from her pretending to read something else, and after about 20 minutes she looked up and said, "You're paying too much for salt and flour." He looked up from his papers. "Hargrove's is the only dry goods in town. Hargrove's is charging you approximately 30% above what the same goods cost in Helena. I saw prices in a newspaper on the train." She turned the ledger slightly toward him and pointed to the column she meant. "That's not a small difference over a year." "I know what Hargrove charges," Wyatt said. There was something in his voice that wasn't quite defensive, but was in that neighborhood. "Then you know you're getting a bad deal. I know I don't have time to drive to Helena every month for supplies." "You don't have to go every month. You bulk order twice a year and you save enough to cover the lamp oil for the entire winter." She kept her tone even, not lecturing, just moving through the numbers the same way she'd move through any practical problem. "And your fence line costs more than it should. Who's selling you the wire?" A pause. "Dunmore. Runs the hardware." "Is he pricing you fairly?" Wyatt was quiet for a moment. "He's the only hardware in 20 miles. "That wasn't what I asked." He looked at her directly for the first time in an hour. There was something shifting behind his eyes. Not irritation exactly, more the particular discomfort of a man who has been managing alone for so long that having someone look at his numbers felt like having someone look at something private. "I'll write to Helena," he said finally. "See what they can do on a bulk wire order." "Good." She closed the ledger. "The rest of it is manageable. You're not spending carelessly. You're just paying too much for a few things, and small overages compound." He nodded once. Then, after a moment, "Where did you learn this?" "My father's house." She said it without warmth. "He ran a substantial business. I wasn't supposed to be interested in how. I was interested anyway. Wyatt absorbed this without comment, which she appreciated. He didn't say anything about her father being proud or what a shame it was that she hadn't been born a son, or any of the things men usually said when a woman demonstrated she understood numbers. He just nodded and picked up his pencil and wrote something in the margin of his paper, and the conversation moved on. She went to her room shortly after. The mattress was harder than she was accustomed to, and the room held the cold in a particular way that suggested the chinking on that wall needed attention. And she lay in the dark listening to the sounds of a house she didn't know yet and thought about the fact that she was here, that she had actually done it. She had expected the fear to feel worse than this. Morning on the Callahan ranch arrived without ceremony. The light came gray and early through Eleanor's south window, and she could hear Wyatt moving in the kitchen before she was fully awake, the sound of the stove being loaded and water being poured. She dressed, managed the process of her morning routine in the small space with the efficiency she had developed over 8 years of necessity, and got herself to the kitchen while the coffee was still working. Wyatt looked at her with mild surprise. "Didn't expect you up this early. What time does Lily need to start her lessons?" He blinked. "She doesn't. There's no school in Red Hollow yet. Hasn't been since the last teacher left last fall." "I know. I'll be teaching her here." Eleanor settled herself at the table. "And Noah, if he'll sit for it. What time does he go out?" "First light. He helps with the cattle in the morning. Then Lily and I start at 8, and Noah joins us when he comes back in, if he's willing." She accepted the coffee Wyatt poured and set in front of her. "Is he reading well?" "Well enough. Better with numbers." "I'll figure out where they are." She wrapped both hands around the cup. The coffee was strong and somewhat over-extracted, which suggested Wyatt had been making it the same way for 3 years, and nobody had told him otherwise. She said nothing about the coffee. There was a hierarchy to what was worth mentioning. Lily appeared for breakfast with her hair brushed and her face washed, which suggested she had made an effort, and she sat down across from Eleanor with the posture of a child who was trying to seem normal and not entirely sure what normal looked like anymore. Eleanor served her without fuss and asked what she had been studying before the teacher left. Lily listed subjects with growing confidence: reading, arithmetic, some history, spelling, which she hated. Eleanor asked why she hated spelling, and Lily said because the rules never worked. Eleanor said she was absolutely right, that English spelling was largely unreasonable, and that the best approach was to learn the words that mattered and treat the rest as someone else's problem. Lily stared at her. "The old teacher said you had to learn all of them." "The old teacher was technically correct," Eleanor said. "I'm telling you there's a better use of your time." Something in Lily's expression shifted. Not trust exactly, but the edge of it. Noah came in from the cattle at 8:30, muddy to the knee and clearly not expecting company at the breakfast table. He stopped when he saw Eleanor still there and looked at his father. "Miss Voss is teaching you and Lily from here on," Wyatt said. Noah's jaw tightened. "I don't need school." "You need to be able to read a contract," Eleanor said before Wyatt could answer, "and figure out when someone's cheating you on a land price. Neither of those are optional if you're going to run this ranch someday." Noah stared at her. "Who said I'm going to run this ranch? Isn't that what you want?" A long pause. He dropped his eyes for just a moment, an involuntary thing, quickly recovered. "Maybe." "Then sit down. We'll start with arithmetic because your sister tells me you're good at it, and I'd like to see how good." He sat down. Not graciously, but he sat. The first week was not easy. Nothing about those early days was easy in the way that people sometimes smooth over in the retelling, where friction disappears and competence announces itself and everything falls into place. None of that happened. Eleanor misjudged the kitchen layout twice and knocked things off shelves she hadn't realized were behind her reach. She underestimated how cold the house got in the night and woke twice with her hands so stiff she had trouble with her buttons, a problem she hadn't had in Philadelphia because there had always been heat maintained through the night. She asked Wyatt about it without making it dramatic, and he added wood to the bedroom stove before turning in after that, without being asked a second time. She spilled a pot of boiling water toward the end of the first week. Not on herself, she caught the edge of it and corrected fast enough. But it crashed, and a significant amount of the supper went with it. She sat looking at the mess on the floor for about 4 seconds, and then she cleaned it up and started the portion of supper that could still be salvaged. Lily watched her from the doorway. Are you going to cry? No, Eleanor said. Mama used to cry sometimes when things went wrong in the kitchen. I'm not your mama, Eleanor said it gently. And I don't cry about spilled water. I did once, but I got over it. Lily was quiet for a moment. Then she came into the kitchen and picked up the rag Eleanor had been using and started mopping the floor without being asked. It was a small thing. It mattered. The accounting work continued in the evenings. Eleanor found 2 more places where the ranch was losing money through habit rather than necessity, and she brought them to Wyatt each time without making him feel incompetent, which required some care. He was a man who had been doing everything himself for 3 years and had developed a particular relationship with his own judgment, and she understood that the difference between useful information and criticism often lay entirely in delivery. She presented it as discovery rather than correction. Here's what I found. Here's what it means. Here's one way to handle it. He listened. He didn't always agree immediately, but he listened, and he came back a day or 2 later and said things like, about what you said about the wire. I wrote to the Helena supplier. We'll see what they come back with. Which was as close as Wyatt Callahan got to saying, you were right. The ranch hands, there were 2, a weathered man called Greer who had been on the property for 8 years, and a younger one named Dalt, who was maybe 20 and still figuring out most things. Gave Eleanor a wide berth at first. Not rudely, just with the particular uncertainty of men who hadn't worked out yet what category to put her in. She didn't push it. She nodded to them when their paths crossed and didn't require anything from them and let them reach their own conclusions. Greer came around faster than she expected. He appeared at the kitchen door one morning with a jar of something and held it out to her. Rendered lard, for the biscuits. Yours were good, but they're better with this kind. Eleanor looked at the jar. You know how to make biscuits? My mother was a cook, he said, with the dignity of a man who had said this before and weathered the response. She taught me things. Then sit down and show me what she taught you, Eleanor said. He did. The biscuits were, in fact, better. It was 11 days into the trial when Noah finally broke. It didn't come from nowhere. It had been building since the first day. The rigid way he held himself at the lesson table. The way he always positioned himself so he could see the door. The particular quality of his silences that were not just the ordinary quiet of a teenage boy, but something heavier. Eleanor had been watching it and had been patient with it because she understood from the inside what it felt like to carry something that had no clean shape. He was at the table working through a geometry problem she had set him. He was good at it, genuinely, better than average. And she was across the room working on the accounts, and Lily had gone outside to help Greer with something, and the house was quiet enough that when Noah put his pencil down flat on the table, the small sound of it was loud. Eleanor looked up. His jaw was working. He was staring at the problem sheet and not seeing it. Noah. He shook his head slightly. A no or a not now, or maybe just a movement that meant leave this alone. She didn't leave it alone. What day did she die? His head came up. His eyes were raw. What? Your mother. What day? February 7th, he said. It came out before he decided to say it. You went out that morning, she said. Not a question. His hands went flat on the table. I told my father I was checking the east fence, but I wasn't. He stopped. I was just out. I went out because I needed to not be in the house. I was gone most of the day, and when it got dark, she came to find me. And the weather came in. Fast. His voice was barely even. She didn't make it back. Eleanor set down her pencil. How long did it take you to find her? Greer found her, not me. He said it like it cost him something. I came in before she did. I didn't know she'd gone out. I didn't know until Greer came back with her, and she was already... He stopped again. The silence held. Noah, Eleanor said carefully. How long had she been going out after you, before that day? He blinked. What? Your father told me she always went out when one of you had been gone too long. He said it was who she was. Was that the first time she'd done it for you? A long pause, something shifting behind his eyes. She'd done it before, he said slowly. When I was 10. I got turned around in the north pasture and she came out. And the time before that, he stopped. His eyes were doing something complicated. She went out after you because she couldn't stay in, Eleanor said. Not because you stayed out. Those are different things. Noah stared at the table. His throat moved. If you had come home at noon that day, Eleanor continued, She would have gone out after some other thing by nightfall. She went out because that was what she did. You know that. You've always known that, which is why you're still carrying it. Because knowing something and being able to put it down are completely different, and nobody told you it was all right to put it down. The silence was very long. When Noah finally looked up, his eyes were wet, and he was clearly furious about it. He pushed back from the table and walked out of the kitchen, out the back door, and Eleanor heard his boots on the steps, and then silence. She went back to the accounts. She didn't go after him. 20 minutes later, he came back in. His eyes were dry. He sat back down at the table and picked up his pencil and looked at the geometry problem, and after a moment he said, without looking up, "I still don't know if I believe that." "You don't have to yet," Eleanor said. "It'll be there when you're ready." He nodded once, barely, and went back to work. The trial period had been set at 1 month. By the end of the second week, neither of them had mentioned it. That was either a good sign or a complicated one, and Wyatt wasn't entirely sure which. He watched Eleanor move through his house and his children's days with a combination of attention and restraint that he found difficult to name. She wasn't trying to replace anything. She wasn't performing warmth. She just showed up every morning and did the next thing that needed doing. He had expected to feel more complicated about her presence. He had expected the chair to be something he was continuously negotiating with, that it would require adjustment and accommodation and planning. What he hadn't expected was that Eleanor would have already worked out the adjustments years before she arrived, and that his main task was simply to not get in her way. He did get in her way occasionally. He caught himself starting to do things for her that she hadn't asked for, out of a reflex that had more to do with discomfort than helpfulness. And she had a way of noticing this and correcting it without making him feel stupid. She said once, very evenly, "If I need help with something, I'll tell you. If I don't ask, assume I've got it." He had tried to follow that. He didn't always succeed, but he tried. The ranch hands had stopped being uncertain about her. Greer had apparently informed Dalt of some working theory he'd developed, because Dalt started appearing at the kitchen door with questions. Could she look at the order list? Did she know why the South Pasture gate latch wasn't seated right? Once an implausible question about whether she knew anything about treating a split hoof, which she didn't, but she told him what she did know and suggested the rest, and he seemed satisfied by the attempt. She was fixing things he hadn't noticed were broken. The loose drawing above the window, the lamp wicks that had been getting trimmed down too far, the fact that Lily had no reading books beyond her primer, which Eleanor addressed by writing 3 letters to a bookseller in Helena and using money from the household account, which she informed Wyatt of matter-of-factly and without asking permission, noting the cost and the reason. He had looked at the notation in the ledger and said nothing, which she seemed to take as agreement, and which it was. The third week brought the first real test, and it came not from inside the house, but from outside it. Wyatt had to go to Red Hollow for supplies. There were things that couldn't wait for the Helena bulk order, and Eleanor said she would come. He looked at her with the expression of a man calculating distances and surfaces and ruts, and she said, "I'm not asking for your opinion on whether I should." He got the wagon ready. Red Hollow on a weekday was not Red Hollow on a train platform, but it was still Red Hollow, and the people in it still had opinions. Eleanor felt the looks the moment the wagon came down the main street. The pause in a conversation here, the turned head there. The woman outside the dressmaker's who made no effort to look away. She kept her posture and watched the street and didn't give anyone the satisfaction of seeing her notice. Wyatt helped her down from the wagon and handed her the chair with the efficiency they'd worked out over the past weeks. She got herself situated, and they went first to Hargrove's Dry Goods. Hargrove himself was a broad man in his 50s with a face that had done a lifetime of outdoor work and a mouth that didn't move much when he talked. He watched Eleanor come through his door and looked at Wyatt. "Brought your, Miss Voss," Wyatt said. "She's helping with the ranch accounts." Hargrove shifted his eyes to Eleanor. "That right." "I'd like your current price list," Eleanor said. "If you have one posted, I can find it myself." A beat. "Don't post prices. You just tell me what you need. Then I'll tell you what we need, and you'll tell me the price, and I'll tell you if it matches the last price listed in the Helena supply catalog, which I have with me." She patted the small case on her lap. "That way we both understand where we are." The negotiation took 15 minutes. Hargrove was not pleased. He did not come down to Helena prices. He had a point, which was that the distance and the service had their own cost. But he came down enough that the savings over a year would be material, and Eleanor took the number and recorded it in the small notebook she kept, and they concluded the business without incident. On the way out, she nearly ran the chair into the step at the door. The threshold was higher than she'd calculated, and the front wheels caught it. She dealt with it efficiently, backing and approaching at a better angle, and was through the door in under 10 seconds. She heard someone behind her say, in the particular voice of someone who wants to be heard, "Can't even get through a door right." She knew the voice. Mabel Crowley. Eleanor stopped. She sat there for 2 full seconds with her back to the woman, and she made the calculation. Then she turned the chair around. Mabel was standing outside the dressmaker's with another woman Eleanor didn't know. Both of them with the composed expressions of people who have just done something and are watching to see what happens next. Eleanor looked at Mabel Crowley for a moment. Then she said, "Good morning, Mrs. Crowley." Mabel's composure flickered. She hadn't expected that. "I got through the door fine," Eleanor continued. "It just required a different angle than you'd use. Most things worth doing do." She held the woman's gaze another beat. "Good day?" She turned back and continued down the boardwalk, and she heard Wyatt's boots beside her a moment later, and he didn't say anything, but she could tell from the particular quality of his silence that he had heard and had chosen to let her handle it, which was the right call, and she appreciated it. They were nearly to the wagon when he said quietly, "She's done that to half the people in this town at one point or another." "I know the type," Eleanor said. "She's not the first. She's persistent." "So am I." Something changed between them that evening. Nothing that could be pointed at easily. No moment, no declared thing. But the quality of the air in the house was different when they sat down to supper. And it had been different all the way home in the wagon, and Eleanor was not someone who ignored evidence. She was practical about these things. She had not come to Montana looking for what most people assumed a woman her age was looking for. She had come for space, for a life that wasn't arranged around someone else's discomfort with her existence. That was enough. That was more than she'd had. But Wyatt Callahan was not what she had expected. She wasn't sure exactly what she had expected. Something more closed, maybe. Something that would require more continuous management. Instead, she had found a man who was genuinely, stubbornly fair, in a way that had nothing to do with being easy. He didn't make allowances for her. He made adjustments, and those were different. Allowances implied pity. Adjustments implied respect for what was actually there. She was not falling in love with him. She was clear on that. But she was beginning to understand that she had arrived ready to fight for everything, and that maybe not everything here required fighting. That was its own kind of unsettling. Lily announced at supper that she had finished the first of the books Eleanor had ordered from Helena, which was a biography of Abigail Adams, and she had opinions. She talked for 12 minutes about Abigail Adams with an intensity that made Wyatt look slightly stunned and made Noah, despite himself, put down his fork and listen. She basically told her husband everything he needed to do, Lily concluded, and he mostly did it. "That's one reading," Eleanor said. "Is there another one?" "There are about 12. That's why she's interesting," Noah said into the pause. "What's the next book?" Eleanor looked at him. He was looking at his plate. "I ordered 3, she said. "The Adams biography, one on the formation of the Western Territories, and one on mathematics and industry." She paused. "You can read whichever one you want next." Noah's jaw worked slightly. "The Territories one," he said. Like it was nothing. Lily immediately said she wanted the same one, and a brief argument began about the order of reading that was so aggressively ordinary, 2 children fighting about books at a dinner table, that Eleanor had to look at her own plate for a moment to keep her expression steady. Wyatt caught it. She knew he did because his own expression did something brief and then settled back. Later, after the children had gone to bed, he came and sat at the table across from her while she was going through the supply notations from town. "Month's almost done," he said. She looked up. "The trial," he said. "We said a month." "I remember." He turned his coffee cup in his hands. It was a thing he did when he was thinking, she had learned. "Lily asked me this morning if you were going to stay." "What did you tell her?" "I told her I didn't know yet." He met her eyes. "I know now." Eleanor sat with that for a moment. "The arrangement would need to be different," she said. "I'm not interested in being a long-term trial. If I stay with a clear understanding of what this is." "I know." "I'm not what you sent for." "No," Wyatt said. You're not. He was quiet for a moment. I think maybe that's the thing. She wasn't sure exactly what he meant by that, but she thought she had some idea. Outside the window, the Montana sky had gone fully dark, the kind of dark that cities never got to, where the stars were a fact rather than a suggestion. Eleanor looked at the numbers in her notebook and then at the lamp flame and thought about the morning she had left Philadelphia. The feeling of the train station, the smell of coal smoke and possibility, the absolute terror of what she was choosing. She had not known what she was coming toward. She still didn't know, completely. But it was looking, tonight, less like an escape and more like an arrival. And that was something she had not let herself want for a very long time. Noah's geometry work sat in a neat stack at the corner of the table where he had left it. Lily's drawing, the new one she'd done that afternoon of what she called the North View, was pinned near the window. The old drawing, Noah's, from when he was little, still hung beside it. Eleanor looked at both of them for a long moment. Then she went back to her numbers, and the lamp burned on, and the house held its warmth against the cold outside. And somewhere in the north pasture the cattle moved through the dark like slow, patient shapes, waiting for morning. The agreement they reached that night wasn't romantic. That was what Eleanor remembered most clearly about it afterward. The particular absence of romance, the way they sat across from each other at the kitchen table with the accounts between them and talked about it the same way they talked about the wire order from Helena. Wyatt said he wanted her to stay. He said it plainly, without decoration. He said the children needed what she was doing for them, and that the ranch was running better, and that he was aware those were practical reasons, but that he wasn't a man who trusted himself to know the difference between practical and otherwise, and he had learned to be honest about that. Eleanor said she would stay. She said the arrangement would need to become formal before spring, that she wasn't willing to exist in a category with no name, not because of pride, but because unnamed arrangements had a way of becoming whatever was convenient for the person with more power, and she'd lived inside enough of those to know how they ended. Wyatt said he understood that. He said they could talk to the circuit preacher when he came through in 6 weeks. She said 6 weeks was acceptable. They shook hands. It was a strange gesture between two people who were agreeing to get married, but it also felt completely right, and neither of them remarked on it. What neither of them knew, on that quiet night in the 4th week of Eleanor's time at the Callahan Ranch, was that 6 weeks was more time than they had. The letter came on a Thursday. Greer brought it in with the supply delivery from town, and he handed it to Eleanor without comment. But she saw the look on his face, a careful blankness that meant he'd already noticed the return address. She turned the envelope over in her hands and felt the weight of it before she opened it. Heavy paper. Philadelphia postmark. The handwriting on the front was the secretary's, not the hand of the man who had sent it, but she knew the hand behind the hand. She'd been looking over her shoulder for it for nearly a year. She put the letter in the pocket of her skirt and finished the morning lessons with Lily before she opened it. It said what she had known it would say. Her father, Mr. Aldrich Voss, whose name she had stopped using when she left Philadelphia on a borrowed ticket and an assumed surname, had located her. The letter didn't say how. It didn't need to. Aldrich Voss had money, and money had reach, and the only thing surprising about the letter was that it had taken this long. The letter informed her that she was expected to return to Philadelphia, that the matter of her care and placement had been arranged in her absence, that a position had been secured for her with a cousin in Connecticut who had the appropriate facilities, and that her continued absence was an embarrassment to the family and a hardship to her father, who had spent considerable resources on her welfare over the years and was owed, at minimum, the consideration of her compliance. There was not a single sentence in the letter that treated her as a person who had the right to make a decision. Eleanor read it twice. Then she folded it back along its original creases and put it in her pocket and went to make lunch. She told Wyatt that evening. She didn't perform distress about it, because she'd spent the day working through the distress while she was doing other things. The way she had learned to handle hard information, absorbing it in layers while her hands were occupied. She handed him the letter and watched him read it. He read it all the way through. Then he set it on the table and looked at it for a moment without speaking. "Your name isn't Voss," he said. "No." She'd been waiting for this. "My name is Eleanor Aldrich. Voss was my mother's family name before she married. I took it when I left because I needed time before he found me." She kept her eyes on him. "I was going to tell you, I was working out when." Wyatt was quiet. The lamp between them threw an unsteady light. "Is there anything else?" he asked. Not angry. The question was genuinely asking whether there was more. "He'll come," she said. "Not himself, probably. He'll send someone first. But eventually, if I don't respond to the letter, he'll come. And when he does, he'll try to take me back. He has a way of framing things so that I seem like a problem he's solving rather than a person he's controlling. He's very good at it. People believe him because he's calm and reasonable sounding, and because most people, when they see someone in a wheelchair, already halfway believe the story that she can't manage her own life." She said this without heat. It was just the mechanics of what would happen. Wyatt turned his coffee cup. "Are we still talking to the preacher in 5 weeks?" She looked at him. "If you still want to." "You lied about your name." "Yes." "Not about anything else?" "No." He looked at the letter again. Then he picked it up and handed it back to her. 5 weeks, he said. "We don't need to change anything." Eleanor took the letter. She tucked it back in her pocket and felt something in her chest do a complicated thing that she wasn't going to examine too closely right now. "He's not going to accept it," she said, "even when we're married. He's the kind of man who thinks a piece of paper is just a new obstacle." "Then we'll deal with that when it gets here," Wyatt said. "We've got 5 weeks before we need to." They did not have 5 weeks. The man her father sent arrived in Red Hollow 11 days later, and he did not come quietly. His name was Granger. Eleanor didn't know his given name. She'd never been told it, had only ever heard him referred to as Granger, in the way that powerful men referred to the people they kept for unpleasant purposes. He was a lawyer, or had been. He was her father's instrument for matters that required a legal veneer over a fundamentally coercive intent. He arrived on a Tuesday and went directly to Hargrove's Dry Goods, which was the center of information in Red Hollow, the way such places always were, and he began talking before he had finished purchasing anything. Eleanor found out from Greer, who had gone into town for a boot repair and had come back with the information the way Greer always came back from town. Understated, accurate, without editorial. "Man named Granger," Greer said, working his hat brim. "At Hargrove's, then at the Crow's Rest for supper. Telling people you're a runaway. That you've been deceptive about your name. Saying the man you're staying with doesn't know what he's taken in." Eleanor received this. "Is he saying I'm dangerous? Saying you're unstable, that your condition affects your judgment, that your father has been worried sick, and that any decent community would help see you return to proper care." She had expected this too. It was the version of events her father had always preferred. Not malice, but concern. Not control, but protection. The benevolent patriarch distressed by his difficult daughter's irrational behavior. It was a story that people wanted to believe because it was tidy. "How many people were listening?" she asked. Greer said, "Both places were busy." She thanked him and went back inside. That night she told Wyatt what Greer had reported, laid it out plainly, and watched him absorb it. "He's been in town one day," Wyatt said. "That's usually enough. The story doesn't need to be believed completely. It just needs to create enough doubt that people start looking at me differently. Doubt compounds, especially in a small town." Wyatt was quiet for a moment. "What do you want to do?" The fact that he asked her this, what did she want, was not something she had expected from any version of this conversation. She looked at him. "I want to go to town," she said. "I want to go to whatever gathering place I can find, and I want people to see me before they've built a complete picture out of what he's been telling them." "The town hall meeting is Thursday," Wyatt said. "Monthly water rights discussion. Half the county turns out." "That," Eleanor said, "that's what I want." The 2 days before the Thursday meeting were the strangest stretch of time Eleanor had experienced since arriving in Montana. Red Hollow's social machinery had started turning in the particular way of small towns receiving new information, and she could feel it even from the ranch, in the way Dalt came in from his supply run slightly quieter than usual, in the way the feed store boy who delivered the grain didn't quite meet her eyes when he handed down the order. Granger had done his work efficiently. He came to the ranch on Wednesday. Eleanor was in the kitchen when she heard the horse. She looked out the window and saw the man dismounting, trim, dark-coated, the deliberate posture of someone who wanted to project authority, and she moved to the front of the house before Wyatt could reach the door. She got there first. She opened it herself. Granger looked at her in the chair, and his expression did the thing she had seen 100 times on 100 faces, The very slight adjustment, the recalibration toward a version of her that was smaller and more manageable than the one he'd been sent to collect. He recovered quickly because he was a professional at this. "Miss Aldrich," he said. He didn't call her Voss. "Mr. Granger. Your father has been very worried." He managed to sound sincere. "He simply wants to know you're safe." "Then you can report that I'm safe," she said. "I'm in good health. I'm managing my own affairs, and I'm exactly where I've chosen to be." "Your father. My father does not have legal authority over me," she said. "I'm 32 years old. I was never declared incompetent by any court, in any state, on any date. If he has a document suggesting otherwise, I'd like to see it, because he threatened this several times in Philadelphia and never produced one." Granger's expression tightened slightly. "There are practical concerns about your... If the practical concern is my wheelchair, you can take that argument back to Philadelphia with you," she said. "It won't find much traction with me." Wyatt had appeared behind her. He stood in the doorway without saying anything, which was the right position, present, visible, not intervening in something that didn't need his intervention. Granger looked at Wyatt. He shifted into the version of this conversation he was more comfortable with, man to man. "Mr. Callahan, I understand you've been generous in providing Miss Aldrich with accommodation. Her father would be grateful if you'd be willing to assist in ensuring her safe return to..." "She's not going back," Wyatt said. His voice was completely flat. "You may not understand the full..." "I understand fine," Wyatt said. "She's told me everything I need to know about her situation. We're getting married in 3 weeks. I'd suggest you go back and tell her father that before he spends any more of his money on train tickets." Granger looked between them. The calculation behind his eyes was visible, if you knew how to look for it. He was assessing what was actually in front of him, whether there was a seam to work on, whether the man in the doorway could be separated from the woman in the chair. Eleanor watched him assess and come up empty. "Your father will hear from his attorneys," Granger said finally. "Then our attorneys will respond," Eleanor said. "Good day, Mr. Granger." She closed the door. The silence in the hallway afterward was long. Then Wyatt said, "We need an attorney." "Do you know one?" "There's one in Billings. I've used him for land contracts. He's competent." "Write to him today," she said. "Tell him what I told you about the incompetency argument. It's the only legal lever my father has, and it won't hold up because he never filed. He threatened it to keep me compliant. If Granger comes back with actual paperwork, I need to know it immediately." "I'll write tonight." He paused. "You knew all of that, about the legal piece." "I spent 2 years in Philadelphia reading everything I could find about women and property law before I left," she said. "I needed to know what he could and couldn't do." Wyatt looked at her for a moment. "You planned this for 2 years." "I planned for everything I could think of," she said. "I didn't plan for you to be..." She stopped. "To be what?" he asked. She considered whether to finish the sentence. Then she said, "Fair. I didn't plan for that." He didn't say anything to that. But he wrote to the attorney in Billings that night, the longest letter she had ever seen him produce, and she proofread it for him and corrected 2 points of fact and added a paragraph she thought was important. And he looked at her addition and said it was better than his version, and she told him to sign it and get it on the Morning Post. Thursday arrived with a cold morning that broke into a sharp, clear afternoon, the kind of Montana spring day that was beautiful in a way that contained a warning. Eleanor dressed carefully. Not for performance, she had no patience for dressing as performance, but because she understood the difference between being seen and being dismissed, and clothing was part of that calculus whether she liked it or not. She wore her best jacket, dark blue wool, fitted, with brass buttons. She had her hair up properly. She looked, she thought, like exactly what she was. A 32-year-old woman who had run a household and managed accounts, and taught 2 children and fixed a ranch that was slowly starting to right itself, and who was not remotely in need of returning to Philadelphia. Wyatt drove them in. Lily had been left with Greer, who had volunteered for this purpose with an earnestness that touched Eleanor more than she showed. Noah had asked to come, and Eleanor had said yes without consulting Wyatt, and Wyatt had not argued. The town hall was a large room above the bank, and by the time they arrived it was already full. Eleanor felt the moment they entered, the collective awareness, the conversations that continued, but didn't quite continue the same way. She had navigated rooms like this before. She had, if she was honest, navigated worse. She found a position near the middle of the room where she could see most of it and most of it could see her. Noah stood slightly behind her to the right, with his particular teenage scowl and his arms crossed, which Eleanor recognized now not as hostility but as protection. This was Noah's battle posture. Wyatt stood to her left. The meeting started with the water rights discussion, which was the stated purpose. Eleanor listened and contributed twice with observations about the Southern Creek allocation that she'd noticed in the ranch accounts, both times briefly, and both times the people around her engaged with what she'd actually said rather than looking at each other first. That was something. Mabel Crowley was in the back of the room. Eleanor had identified her within the first minute. It was 40 minutes into the meeting when Granger made his move. She hadn't seen him come in. He had positioned himself near the door, which was either natural or deliberate, and when the water rights discussion reached a natural pause, he spoke up from the back. "If I might address the community briefly," he said. He had the voice of a man who was used to rooms listening to him. "I've come to Red Hollow on a matter that concerns the welfare of one of its recent arrivals. I believe many of you have questions about the woman known as Eleanor Voss." The room went quiet in the wrong way, the kind of quiet that meant everyone was deciding how to hold their faces. Granger spoke for about 4 minutes. He was skilled. Eleanor gave him that. He didn't attack directly. He expressed concern. He described a father who was beside himself with worry over a daughter who had fled a home where she was cared for, who had concealed her identity, who was, here a careful pause, managing a disability that her family worried affected her capacity to make sound judgments. He didn't use the word incompetent. He didn't need to. He built the shape of it without the word, and let the room fill in the rest. Eleanor had been sitting very still through all of it. She could feel Noah beside her. The tension in him had gone wire tight. She put her hand back slightly, not touching him, just making her presence felt. When Granger finished, she spoke. "Thank you, Mr. Granger." Her voice was clear. The room's acoustics were reasonable. "I'll respond to each point." Granger looked at her with the expression of a man who had expected this, but had hoped against it. "My name is Eleanor Aldrich. I used my mother's family name when I arrived because I needed time before my father located me, and I would make the same choice again. I told the man I'm engaged to marry the complete truth before he asked me to stay. That is not concealment, that is timing." She looked at the room, not at Granger. "I left my father's house because my father does not recognize a distinction between caring for someone and owning them. I was not in danger of starvation or neglect. I was in danger of spending the rest of my life in a room being managed by people who had decided what I was capable of before I'd tried anything." A few faces in the crowd were still blank, but several were not. "I use a wheelchair. I have for 8 years. I have, in the past month at the Callahan Ranch, managed a household, instructed 2 children, reorganized the supply accounts, identified and corrected several costly contracting errors, and learned things from Greer Halsey's biscuit recipe that I intend to keep using for the rest of my life." A small ripple went through the room at that last part. Not laughter exactly, but something that released tension. "I am not a woman who needs protecting from her own choices. I am a woman who made a deliberate choice to come here and build something, and who is asking this community to judge me on what I've actually done, rather than what one man, who has a financial interest in my return, has suggested about me from the back of the room." Silence. Then Mabel Crowley's voice from the side. "You lied about your name." Eleanor turned toward her. "I used a different name," she said. "Women who lie about who they are don't generally travel 4 days on a train and show up in a wheelchair in front of an entire town." Another ripple. This one was different. "She's got a point," said a man near the front. Eleanor didn't know him. He was weathered in the way of ranchers, with a face that had made up its mind about things and wasn't easily revisited. "That isn't the issue," Mabel said, but she sounded slightly less certain. Granger tried to recover. He turned to Wyatt. "Mr. Callahan, with respect, you've only known this woman a month. You can't be certain." "I'm certain enough," Wyatt said. He hadn't said much. He didn't need to. When Wyatt Callahan spoke in a room, people who knew him tended to listen. "She fixed what I'd let go wrong on that ranch for 3 years. My kids are learning. The accounts are straight. She walked." He stopped, amended. "She came into town last month and dealt with Hargrove on prices without anyone's help, and she got a fair deal, which is more than I can say for what I'd been getting." He looked at Granger. "Her father sent you out here. That's a man I've never met, who's never seen his daughter do a day's work on frontier land. I've watched her do it for a month. I know which one of us is better informed about what she can and can't do." The room shifted. There was no single moment that decided it. That was never how rooms worked. But the weight of it moved. Noah said something then. He said it quietly, not quite to the room, more to the space in front of him, but in the way that quiet things sometimes carry. "She told me something about my mother that nobody else ever said out loud. That it wasn't my fault. I've been carrying that for 3 years, and she said it in about 2 minutes and made me actually believe it." He stopped. He was 14 and he was mortified at himself for saying it, and he pressed his jaw together after. "That's what she does. She says the thing that's actually true." Nobody said anything for a moment. Then the weathered man at the front looked at Granger and said, "I think you have your answer." Granger did not leave Red Hollow that day. Eleanor had expected that. Men like Granger didn't leave when the room went against them. They reassessed and found another angle. The other angle turned out to be Mabel Crowley. Eleanor found out from Mrs. Patton, who ran the boarding house and who had, over the past 3 weeks, developed a cautious warmth toward Eleanor based on the fact that Eleanor had given her an accurate calculation of the cost efficiency of bulk ordering her linens, and Mrs. Patton was a woman who responded to accurate calculations. Mrs. Patton came to the ranch the following morning, which was unusual enough to signal importance, and told Eleanor that Granger had spent the evening at Mabel Crowley's house. "They were in there 3 hours," Mrs. Patton said. "She had the manner of a woman who reported facts without editorial, but wanted you to understand that she was aware of what those facts implied." "What do you know about Mabel Crowley?" Eleanor asked. Mrs. Patton turned her cup. "She wanted Wyatt Callahan to court her after Clara died 2 years ago. He didn't. He was," a careful pause, "not unkind about it. But he was clear." Eleanor absorbed this. "And Mabel is the kind of woman," Mrs. Patton continued, "who doesn't put things down easy." This was information that Eleanor should have had earlier, but she hadn't known to ask for it, and there was no use in wishing she had. She thanked Mrs. Patton and saw her out and went back to the kitchen and stood at the window and thought. Granger needed something he could put in front of a judge or a magistrate, or at minimum something he could use to pressure Wyatt into withdrawing his support. Mabel Crowley wanted Eleanor gone for reasons that had nothing to do with Aldrich Voss and everything to do with a man who had been clear about his feelings 2 years ago. Two people who wanted the same outcome for completely different reasons were a more dangerous combination than either one alone. She was thinking through what they might do when Wyatt came in from the north pasture for lunch, and she told him what Mrs. Patton had said. He went still in the particular way he had when his mind was working. "She'll find something," he said, "or make something. She knows everyone in this county." "What's the most vulnerable thing?" Eleanor asked. "The children," he said, and his jaw was hard when he said it. Someone could argue, with the right framing, that the children's welfare is being neglected, that they're being taught by someone unqualified, that the household is better run than it's been in 3 years. You said that. "I know." He sat down. "But it's not what's true that matters in that kind of argument. It's what you can make a magistrate consider." Eleanor was quiet for a moment, then, "I need to write to my cousin in Connecticut." Wyatt looked at her. "She's a real person," Eleanor said. "My father mentioned her in the letter. He said he'd arranged my care with her, but my cousin Margaret and I correspond privately. She didn't agree to it. He told her something else, I'd guess, the way he always tells people something else. I need her account of what he actually said to her, in writing, because if he misrepresented his intentions to her, that undermines everything Granger is presenting as my father's legitimate concern." Wyatt thought about this. "How long would the letter take?" "A week each way, minimum. 2 weeks before I have anything back. We're getting married in 18 days. I know." They looked at each other. "Write the letter," he said. "Tonight." She wrote it that night, 3 pages, precise, with specific questions at the end about what her father had told Margaret and what Margaret had actually agreed to. She read it back twice and sealed it and gave it to Greer for the Morning Post, and then she sat in the kitchen after everyone had gone to bed and felt, for the first time since coming to Montana, the specific weight of being genuinely afraid. Not afraid of Granger, not afraid of Mabel Crowley, afraid of the old and practiced machinery of her father's authority, which she had watched flatten things before. Good things. True things. Things that should have been able to stand on their own and didn't, because the man applying pressure was systematic and patient and had money where she had only arguments. She had argued well in that town hall. She knew that. But arguments only held if the audience kept holding them. And she had seen too many times how audiences changed when the pressure continued long enough. She was still sitting there when she heard Wyatt's door, and then his boots, and then he appeared in the kitchen doorway. He looked at her without surprise. He seemed to have developed a habit of knowing when she was still awake. He sat down across from her without asking. "I'm not going back," she said. She said it to the table, not to him. "I know. Even if it gets worse than this. I know that too." She looked up at him. "You don't have to do this. He's going to make it unpleasant for you. He has money and he has time and he is not going to accept this without making it cost something." Wyatt looked at her steadily. "You told me in the first week that you don't need me to make decisions for you. You were right about that." He turned his cup once. "This is one I'm making for myself. I've thought about it and I'm clear on it, and I'd appreciate it if you'd let me be clear on it without arguing." She held his gaze. "Fine," she said. "Good." The lamp burned low between them. Outside, the Montana wind had come up again, the way it did at night, moving through the grass with a sound like something breathing. Eleanor listened to it and thought about the letter on its way to Connecticut, and the attorney in Billings, and the 18 days between now and a ceremony that would change the legal landscape considerably, and the fact that her father had not, in 32 years, encountered a situation he couldn't eventually bend. She was about to become one. She sat with Wyatt in the kitchen until the lamp needed oil, and then she filled it, and they sat a little longer, and nobody said anything much, and it was the most company she had felt in years. The letter from Margaret arrived in 12 days, not 14. Eleanor was in the kitchen when Greer brought it in, and she knew what it was before he said anything because he was holding it slightly away from his body, the way he held things he considered important. She took it from him, turned it over, recognized her cousin's handwriting on the back flap, Margaret's particular cramped cursive, always slightly uphill, and she made herself set it on the table and finish what she was doing at the stove before she opened it. She burned the edge of her hand on the pot handle doing this, because she was not paying full attention to the stove. She ran cold water over it and did not swear, which cost her something, and then she sat down and opened the letter. Margaret had written 4 pages. Margaret was a deliberate woman who thought carefully before she wrote, and 4 pages from Margaret meant she had something to say and had organized it. The first page was preamble, how she was, how her household was, expressing concern for Eleanor's welfare in the careful language of a woman who didn't want to commit to anything before she'd laid the ground. Eleanor read it quickly and moved on. The second page was where it began. Her father had written to Margaret in February, Margaret said. He had told her that Eleanor had suffered a recent deterioration, that word, deterioration, used twice, in her mental and emotional condition, and that a physician had recommended a period of supervised rest in a calm household environment. He had asked whether Margaret might be willing to provide this environment for a period of no more than 6 months, framing it as a favor between family members and offering a stipend. Margaret had agreed because she had no reason to believe her uncle would misrepresent a medical situation, and because she loved Eleanor and thought she was helping. She had not agreed to anything permanent. She had not agreed to anything that would restrict Eleanor's freedom of movement or communication. She had understood herself to be offering a guest room to a cousin who was unwell, not a holding facility to a father who had decided his daughter's life for her. The third page said that she had since received Eleanor's letter and had subsequently written to the physician her uncle had referenced, requesting a copy of the relevant documentation. The physician had no record of treating Eleanor. He had apparently treated Aldrich Voss himself for a stomach complaint in January, which was the extent of their professional relationship. The fourth page said that Margaret was prepared to provide a sworn statement to this effect before a notary, and that she was, to use her own precise language, extremely displeased with her uncle and prepared to say so clearly to anyone who needed to hear it. Eleanor read the letter a second time. Then she folded it carefully and held it in her hands for a moment. The physician had never treated her. Her father had fabricated the medical recommendation entirely. She had suspected this. She had spent 2 years suspecting it because she knew her father, knew the quality of his certainty about his own rights over her life. But suspecting something and having it in writing from a third party were different orders of fact, and she sat with the difference for a long moment. Then she took the letter and found Wyatt. He read it at the kitchen table while she stood at the window. She could see his eyes moving through it, the pace of his reading, the place where his jaw tightened on the third page. He set it down flat when he finished and looked at the table for a moment. "There was no doctor," he said. "No. He invented the medical concern. He does this. He finds the framework that makes him sound reasonable and builds inside it. A worried father, a physician's recommendation, a willing cousin. Every piece sounds legitimate until you pull on one of them." She turned from the window. Margaret pulled on one. Wyatt picked up the letter again and read the last page a second time. "She'll give a sworn statement." "She will. She's angry. Margaret doesn't get angry often, which means when she does, she's thorough about it. I'll write to the attorney in Billings today," he said. "He needs this." "And Granger needs to know we have it," Eleanor said. "Not the details, just that we have it. If he knows the fabricated physician argument collapses, it removes most of what he could put in front of a magistrate." Wyatt looked at her. "You want to tell him?" "I want him to carry that information back to my father before my father spends money on a legal action that he'll lose." She kept her voice even. "Not because I'm being generous. Because a legal proceeding, even one he loses, takes time and costs money and is designed to exhaust the other party into compliance. If he knows he loses before he files, he may decide the cost isn't worth it. And if he decides it is, then we fight it from a stronger position than we'd have had without Margaret's letter." She sat down across from him. "I'm not saying this ends it. I'm saying this changes the math." Wyatt was quiet for a moment. He turned the letter in his hands. Then, "I'll get the wagon ready. We can be in town by noon. I can go alone." "I know you can," he said. "I'm coming anyway." By now, the difference between Wyatt inserting himself where he wasn't needed and Wyatt making a deliberate choice to stand somewhere. This was the second kind. What? Granger was at the Crow's Rest when they found him. He was eating lunch alone at a corner table with a folder of papers in front of him, and the careful isolation of a man who was working, and he looked up when they came in and his expression went through several small adjustments before settling. Eleanor had asked Wyatt to let her lead this. He had agreed. She brought her chair to the table and looked at Granger directly. "We have a letter from my cousin Margaret Aldrich. In it, she states that my father told her I had received a medical recommendation for supervised rest, and that she has since contacted the physician referenced and discovered that no such recommendation exists. She let this land. She is prepared to provide a sworn statement before a notary." Granger's expression didn't collapse because he was a professional, and professionals don't let their expressions collapse. But something behind his eyes went very still. "My father invented the medical concern," Eleanor said. "I imagine you didn't know that, or possibly you did and were hoping it wouldn't surface. Either way, I wanted you to have the information before my attorney in Billings files it as part of the response to whatever legal action my father has been planning." Granger was quiet for a moment. He straightened the papers in front of him without looking at them. "Your father is concerned about your welfare," he said. But the declaration had less weight behind it than it had on the train platform. "My father is concerned about his authority," she said. "Those have always been the same thing to him. I understand that better than you do, because I lived inside it for 32 years. She folded her hands on the table. "I am not returning to Philadelphia. I am marrying Wyatt Callahan in 11 days. I have an attorney, I have documentation, and I have a sworn statement from a family member who was deceived. If my father wants to continue this, those are the facts he'll be working against." Granger looked at Wyatt. Wyatt looked back at him and said nothing. The silence stretched for about 10 seconds, which was longer than it sounds. "I'll communicate your position to your father," Granger said finally. "Do that," Eleanor said. She turned her chair and left, and Wyatt fell in beside her, and neither of them spoke until they were outside and the door of the Crow's Rest had closed behind them. "You didn't give him anything to work with," Wyatt said. "That was the point." She let out a breath. "He'll go back. Whether my father accepts what he comes back with is a different question. What do you think your father does next?" She thought about it. "He comes himself," she said. "He always does, eventually, when the instruments fail. He thinks his physical presence changes the calculation." She paused. "For most people it does. But not for you." "Not anymore," she said. And she meant it. though she was aware that meaning something and feeling it completely through all your bones were not always the same thing simultaneously. The 10 days before the wedding were not the 10 days Eleanor would have designed. She had not thought much about the wedding itself. She was not a woman who had spent her life imagining ceremonies, but she had thought the final stretch would be relatively settled, that the battle with her father's machinery would have reached some kind of pause. Instead, Mabel Crowley moved. Eleanor found out about it the same way she found out about most things in Red Hollow, from Greer, who had a talent for absorbing information without appearing to seek it. Mabel had gone to 3 households in town and told them she had concerns about the Callahan children's welfare. She had spoken to the wife of the county land recorder, who had a distant relation in some official capacity. She had suggested that the arrangement at the Callahan ranch was irregular, that the children were being instructed by a woman with no formal teaching credentials, that the household was being run by someone who had misrepresented herself to the community. None of these things were, strictly speaking, untrue, but they were assembled in a particular order that implied a conclusion none of the individual facts actually supported. Eleanor listened to Greer's account and then said, "Is there a formal complaint being filed?" Greer said he didn't think so, not yet. "Then it's social pressure," Eleanor said, "not legal." "It's working," Greer said. He said it without judgment, just as a report. "The Pattersons, they're the ones who run the North Boundary Ranch, so they were friendly at the meeting last week. Mrs. Patterson didn't return away from Wyatt yesterday in town." Eleanor absorbed this. "All right." She thought about it for the rest of the afternoon and into the evening. She thought about it while she was doing the supper dishes, and while Lily was reading at the table, and while Noah was working through the geometry problem she'd set him, which was harder than the last one because he was ready for harder. The social fabric of a small town was a real thing. It wasn't legal authority. It couldn't force her out, but it could make the ranch an island, could make every supply run a small battle, could make the children's lives harder, in the particular ways that children's lives became harder when their family was the subject of public discomfort. That was a different kind of harm than a magistrate's order, and in some ways more persistent because there was no document to challenge. After supper, when the children had gone to bed, she told Wyatt what Greer had reported. He listened. He had the expression he got when he was computing something with several moving parts. "She's not going to stop," he said, "not until something changes her incentive." "She wants me gone," Eleanor said. "Or she wants you to be... I don't know. I'm not sure she knows exactly what she wants. I think she started this for one reason, and now it's become about something else." "What's something else?" Eleanor thought about how to say it. "She made a public investment in opposing me, at the town meeting, in front of everyone. If she backs down now, she looks wrong. People who are afraid of looking wrong will keep pushing past the point where it serves any original purpose." Wyatt was quiet. "You could talk to her," Eleanor said. He looked at her. "Not to negotiate," she said. "You don't negotiate with this. But if she thinks you're willing to engage with her directly, not through me, not through the community, it might change something. She has a grievance with you that's older than my arrival." The silence was very particular. "You know about that," he said. "Mrs. Patton told me. I should have mentioned it earlier." Wyatt turned his cup. He turned it a long time. "I wasn't unkind to her." "I know. She knows that too, I think, which is possibly the problem." Eleanor kept her tone neutral. Unkindness would give her a cleaner story. As it is, she has to make one. He looked at her. "You're remarkably calm about all of this." "I'm not calm," she said. "I've gotten good at looking calm. There's a difference, and it's been wearing on me for 11 days. He looked at her directly, and she let him, which was different from usual. Usually, she kept her expression functional, managed. She let him see, for just a moment, that she was tired. He said quietly, 7 more days. She nodded. 7 more days until the ceremony that would restructure the legal landscape, that would give her the name and the standing that her father's machinery had never been able to touch. 7 more days. "I'll talk to Mabel," he said. He went the next afternoon. He didn't tell Eleanor what he was going to say, and she didn't ask, because she'd said what she thought, and the rest was his to carry. He was gone 2 hours. When he came back, he sat down at the table, and she poured him coffee and waited. "She's not going to stop," he said. "I thought as much. But she's going to be quieter about it. She said what she had to say, and she heard what I had to say." He wrapped his hands around the cup. She's not a bad person. She's a person who's been hurting in a specific direction for 2 years and took the first available thing to press on. Eleanor said nothing for a moment. Then, what did you say to her? I told her I was sorry she'd been hurt. I told her it wasn't something I'd chosen to happen, but that it happened and I should have addressed it more directly instead of just being clear once and then leaving it. He paused. I told her Eleanor was going to be my wife, and that was settled, and that her continuing to create difficulty for Eleanor was going to make things worse for everyone, including her. Was she angry? At first, then less so. He was quiet for a moment. She cried some. I didn't know what to do with that. There wasn't anything to do, Eleanor said. You were right to say what you said. The rest of it was hers to work through. He looked at her. She called you formidable. Eleanor raised an eyebrow. That's the nicest thing she's said about me. She meant it somewhat less nicely than it sounds. I know, but I'll take it. 4 days before the wedding, Aldrich Voss arrived in Red Hollow. Eleanor had expected this. She had told Wyatt she expected it. But there was still something about the reality of him stepping off the train. She heard about it within an hour through Mrs. Patton's network. That was different from the expectation. He was 61 years old, her father. She had not seen him in nearly 14 months. He was a compact man, not tall, with white hair that he kept carefully, and a face that had aged without appearing to have aged, the particular preservation of men who have never experienced genuine hardship. He dressed expensively in a way that was calibrated to look merely respectable. He was always the most reasonable-sounding person in any room. He came to the ranch. Eleanor had known he would, and she had thought about whether to be in the house or outside when he arrived, and she had decided outside. She was in the yard when his rented wagon came down the lane, positioned near the garden bed she and Lily had started 2 weeks ago, with her hands in a pair of old work gloves and a trowel in her right hand. She had not planned this specifically. She had genuinely been working on the garden. But she was aware, as his wagon stopped, that the image was exactly what she would have chosen. He climbed down and looked at her. He had always had a way of looking at her that performed sadness, as if her existence was something he was bravely managing. Eleanor, he said. He didn't use a title. He never had. Father, she said. She pulled off one glove. He looked at the garden, at the house, at the yard around her. His face arranged itself into a version of concern. You've been working in the dirt. Gardening, she said. Lily and I are putting in kitchen herbs. It'll save money on the supply runs. Eleanor. He took 2 steps toward her. I've come a very long way. I know. I imagine it wasn't comfortable. She kept her tone even. You could have saved yourself the trip. I've been clear in my responses through Mr. Granger. Granger told me you've become, he searched for the word, entrenched. Granger told you I had documentation that undermined your legal position, she said. Entrenched is a more manageable way to frame it. His expression flickered. Just for a moment, the performed sadness went somewhere else, and something more honest moved behind his eyes. She had seen it before. It was the look he got when someone wasn't following the script he'd brought. You fabricated a physician's recommendation, she said. Margaret has confirmed it. Our attorney in Billings has the documentation. I was protecting you, he said. Margaret needed a reason to... You lied to her, Eleanor said, about a doctor who never treated me. And you lied to anyone you told the story to. That's not protection. That's management. She pulled off the second glove. Come inside if you want coffee. I'm not having this conversation in the yard. She turned and went up the ramp Wyatt had built along the side of the porch steps. Built it one Saturday without announcement, saying only that the yard wasn't level enough in that spot. And she heard her father following her, and she heard his footsteps pause when he saw the ramp, and she did not acknowledge the pause. Inside, Wyatt was at the table. He had known the wagon was coming. Dalt had signaled from the lane. And he was sitting there in a way that was perfectly ordinary and completely deliberate. He stood when Aldrich Voss came through the door. Mr. Voss, he said. Wyatt Callahan. Her father looked at Wyatt the way men of his type always looked at men of Wyatt's type, assessing, recalibrating, deciding what kind of problem this was. Wyatt was bigger than her father had probably expected. Quieter seeming too, which could be read as malleable until you spent 30 seconds in a room with him and realized the quiet was not a deficit. Mr. Callahan, her father said, I appreciate you taking Eleanor in, what she must have put you through. She hasn't put me through anything, Wyatt said. Sit down, Mr. Voss. Eleanor's making coffee. This, being redirected to sit in someone else's kitchen while the woman he'd come to collect made coffee, was not a dynamic Aldrich Voss had expected. He sat, and his expression reorganized itself, and Eleanor put the coffee on without looking at him. We're getting married in 4 days, Wyatt said, in the tone of a man stating a weather fact. Eleanor's already spoken to you about the documentation. Our attorney has the full record. I don't think there's a legal path that gets you what you want here, and I think you know that. My concern is for my daughter's well-being, her father said. Surely you can— Your concern, Eleanor said from the stove, has always been for your own sense of order. I want to be fair to you, so I'll say this once clearly. I don't believe you think you're a bad father. I think you genuinely believe that managing my life is the same as caring for it. But I've been clear for 2 years about the difference, and the answer has always been no, and the answer is still no. She turned with the coffee. She put a cup in front of him and sat across from him at the table and looked at him directly in a way she had not allowed herself to do since she was 25 years old and had still been hoping something would change. I am not sick, she said. I am not confused. I am not broken. I use a wheelchair, and I always will, and it doesn't disqualify me from building a life. The life I've built here in 8 weeks is better than anything you arranged for me in 8 years. She kept her voice level. I'm asking you to go home, not because I'm afraid of you, and not because I'm angry, but because there is genuinely nothing left for you to do here. Aldrich Voss looked at his coffee cup. He was quiet for a long time. Eleanor watched her father's face and saw, in it, the calculation she had always seen, the continuous assessment of available moves, the reluctance to accept a board position that offered none. He was not stupid. She had never thought he was stupid. She had only thought he was wrong about what she was. You have an attorney, he said finally. Not to her, to Wyatt. In Billings, Wyatt said. He's good. Her father turned the cup in his hands. It was a gesture that reminded her, uncomfortably, of Wyatt, though everything else about them was entirely different. The documentation Margaret provided is complete, Eleanor said, and on record. He looked at her. In his face, she saw something she had not expected, not defeat exactly, but a kind of tired recognition. He was 61 years old, and he had traveled a very long way, and the room he was sitting in contained 2 people who had clearly decided something and were not going to undecide it, and he was finding, perhaps for the first time, the edge of what his particular authority could reach. You look well, he said. It came out quiet, almost unguarded. She studied him. I am well. The chair, he started, has nothing to do with how I am, she said. It never did. You spent years believing otherwise. That was your limitation, not mine. He looked at her for a long moment. Something in his face moved. He picked up his coffee and drank it. He set the cup down. I'll need to speak with Granger, he said. Of course, Eleanor said. I'll have him review the situation. He was saying this to the table, to the cup, to something slightly to the side of both of them. There may not be grounds to— I'll need him to look at it. Eleanor looked at Wyatt. Wyatt was looking at her father with the particular expression he used when he was being patient with something that required patience. Thank you for making the trip, Eleanor said to her father. She meant it, partially. She understood what it had cost him to come, not in money, but in the other currency. The acknowledgement that the instruments had not worked, that he was required to show up himself. She understood, too, that this conversation was going to take more time to settle inside him than a single afternoon could provide. He was not a man who changed his understanding quickly, if he changed it at all. But he had come, and he had sat in her kitchen, and he had looked at her life and not been able to find what he'd expected to find. That was something. It wasn't everything, but it was something. Oh, he stayed in Red Hollow 2 more days. He did not come to the ranch again. Eleanor heard, through Mrs. Patton, that he had walked around the town, had spoken to Hargrove and to the land recorder's wife and to a few others. She didn't know what he'd said. She didn't ask. She thought that what he was doing was building an account of the place she lived in, the same way she had built her account from the ledger and the kitchen and the window that looked south toward the barn, trying to understand, in his own language, what kind of life his daughter had chosen and whether it made any sense to him. She didn't know if it did. She suspected it didn't, not entirely. But on the second day, Greer brought word that Granger's wagon had been seen heading to the rail station, and on the third morning, the rented wagon that carried her father followed it. He did not stop at the ranch on his way out. She had not expected him to. What he left behind him was a particular kind of silence, the silence of a threat that has not quite resolved but has moved to a different room. Eleanor lived inside that silence and assessed it honestly. He might still file something. He might not. He had the resources to continue if he chose. But she had the documentation and the attorney, and in 2 days she would have a name that was legally her own choice in a way he couldn't unilaterally undo. 2 days. Lily asked her the night before the wedding whether she was nervous. Eleanor thought about it. "A little," she said. "Are you?" Lily thought about it with the same seriousness she gave to geometry problems. "I don't want you to leave," she said. "After. In the stories, people leave after weddings." "I'm not leaving," Eleanor said. "This is where I live." Lily seemed to test this information for weight. "Forever?" "That's the plan," Eleanor said. Lily nodded, slowly, with the expression of someone filing important data. Then she went back to her book, which was currently the history of the Western Territories, and Eleanor sat beside her and worked on the household accounts, and the lamp burned between them, and outside the Montana evening settled over the ranch in its slow and enormous way. Noah came in from the barn at 8:30. He was muddy again, and he smelled like cattle, and he stopped in the kitchen doorway with the wary energy he still carried in doorways, checking the room before he entered. "You staying?" he asked. He was looking at the floor when he said it. "Yes," Eleanor said. He nodded. He went to clean up without another word. She watched him go and thought about the boy who had sat at her table 3 months ago with 8 words of compliance and nothing else, and about all the incremental distances between that boy and this one, and about how distances only looked short in retrospect. The wedding was small. It was exactly what it needed to be. The circuit preacher came through on the right day, which was not guaranteed, and the ceremony was held in the main room of the ranch house because Eleanor had no interest in performing it for Red Hollow's benefit, and the witnesses were Greer and Mrs. Patton, who brought a covered dish nobody had asked for and which was excellent. Lily wore her best dress and stood very straight throughout. Noah stood slightly to the side with his arms at his resting, careful posture, and his jaw set in the particular way that meant he was trying not to feel anything obvious. When the preacher asked the necessary question, and Wyatt answered it, Noah looked at the floor. When Eleanor answered it, Noah looked up. She noticed. She thought he didn't know she had. Afterward, they ate the meal that Greer and Eleanor had made together, with Mrs. Patton's covered dish adding more than its share. And Lily talked through most of it, and Noah ate more than anyone else. And Wyatt sat at the head of the table he'd sat at alone for 3 years and looked like a man recalibrating his internal landscape. That night, when the house was quiet, Eleanor sat at the window of the room that was now differently hers. The same room, same view south toward the barn, same draft from the north wall, but a different weight to it. And she thought about her father on the eastbound train, and about Mabel Crowley and her house on the far side of town, and about Granger and his folder of papers, and about everything that was not finished, because nothing was ever finished, because the frontier didn't grant that. She thought about the morning she had come down those train steps in front of the entire platform, and the silence, and Mabel Crowley's voice, and the 40 minutes of wagon ride in which she'd told Wyatt what she could do and what she couldn't. She thought about 8 years of learning to live at a different angle than most people used, and about how that had turned out to be, of all the things she'd expected, a kind of preparation she hadn't known she was making. The ranch was quiet around her. The cattle were shapes in the dark pasture. The wind was coming from the north the way it always did at night, reliable and indifferent, and completely without malice, which was more than she could say for most forces she'd encountered. She had a name that was legally her choice. She had accounts she understood, and children she was watching become themselves, and a man in the next room who had read her father's letter and said, 5 weeks. She had a ramp on the porch that nobody had announced. She pulled the blanket across her lap and let the window show her the dark and the stars, and she sat there for a while in the particular quiet of a life that had not resolved but had, perhaps, finally begun. The letter from Billings arrived 3 weeks after the wedding, and it said what Eleanor had hoped it would say, and had not allowed herself to fully believe until she held it in her hands. The attorney, his name was Holt, a methodical man who wrote in complete sentences and charged fairly, informed them that Aldrich Voss had retained Philadelphia counsel to explore legal options regarding Eleanor's status and the validity of her marriage. Holt had responded with Margaret's sworn statement, the record of the physician who had no documentation of treating Eleanor, and a thorough accounting of Eleanor's demonstrated competence in managing the Callahan ranch accounts over the preceding 2 months. He had also cited 3 relevant territorial statutes regarding a married woman's legal standing in Montana, which collectively made the path Voss's attorneys were exploring both expensive and almost certainly unsuccessful. Voss's attorneys had requested 60 days to review. Holt recommended they grant it and wait. Eleanor read the letter twice and then set it on the table and looked at the window for a moment. Outside, Lily was in the yard doing something with a length of rope and a fence post that probably had a purpose Eleanor hadn't been informed of. The morning light was the flat, clean light of early June, and the garden bed was coming up with the particular stubbornness of things that had been properly planted. 60 days. After everything, the train platform, the ledgers, the town meeting, Granger at the Crow's Rest, her father in the kitchen, it had arrived at 60 days of waiting while lawyers exchanged letters at a distance. She could work with 60 days. She had been working with harder things than 60 days. She wrote back to Holt that afternoon and told him to proceed as he saw fit and to send her the bills directly, which was a point she had established early and which Wyatt had not argued with, because he understood by now that the billing address was not a minor thing. The summer came in hard and fast the way Montana summers did, without much transition between the cold that lingered and the heat that arrived, and the ranch moved into the rhythm of the long light months with work that expanded to fill every available hour. The cattle needed moving to the upper pasture. The south fence had a section that had been borderline all winter and needed replacing before it failed at the worst possible moment. The root cellar required restocking before the season turned again. Eleanor was in the middle of all of it. Not in the way that a person directs things from a distance, but in the way of someone who has become genuinely embedded in the working of a place. She was in the supply orders and the accounts and the teaching schedule and the kitchen, and she was also in the decisions. Wyatt started bringing things to her as a matter of course, not because he couldn't decide, but because he'd found that talking through a problem with her produced a better outcome than working through it alone, and he was a man honest enough with himself to use that when it was available. It was not always smooth. There were days the kitchen went wrong, days the children were difficult in the ways children are difficult when they're growing and everything is too small for them, days the accounts revealed problems that didn't have clean solutions. There was a week in July when the cattle lost a calf to something that started in the south herd, and Greer and Wyatt and Dalt were out every morning before light trying to contain it, and the house ran on less sleep and more tension than anyone preferred. Eleanor managed the household through that week with the particular combination of competence and restraint that the situation required. She kept the meals steady and the children's routine intact, and she didn't ask questions. Wyatt didn't have answers to yet, which was its own kind of help. When the crisis passed and the herd stabilized, Wyatt came in one night and sat down and looked like a man who had been running on will alone for 8 days and had just been told he could stop. Eleanor put food in front of him without ceremony. He ate half of it and then sat back. "Thank you," he said. It was not the kind of thank you that referred only to the meal. "The children didn't panic," she said. "They were worried, but they didn't panic." He looked at her. "That's because of you." "That's because they're resilient," she said. "I just made sure the ground under them stayed level enough for the resilience to work." He turned his fork in his hand. "There's a difference between those two things?" "Considerable," she said. He thought about this. Then he picked up the rest of his food and finished it, and the evening settled around them. And Eleanor thought that this, the unspectacular endurance of difficult stretches, was most of what love actually consisted of, and that most people talked about the other parts because this part was harder to make interesting in the telling. Holt wrote again at the end of July. Voss's attorneys had concluded their review. They had declined to file. The letter was 4 sentences. Eleanor read them standing up in the kitchen because she'd been standing when Greer brought it in, and she stood there for a moment after she'd finished and felt something she didn't immediately have a word for. Not triumph. Triumph was too clean. It was something more worn down and more genuine than triumph. The feeling of a person who has held a position against sustained pressure for long enough that when the pressure finally ceases, the absence of it is almost disorienting. She told Wyatt at supper. He looked at the letter. He looked at it for a while. It's done, he said. It's done, she said. Lily looked between them and said, What's done? A legal matter, Eleanor said. It resolved in our favor. Is that the thing with your father? Yes. Lily absorbed this. Good, she said, with the precise economy of a 10-year-old who has been observing adult complications for months and has clear opinions about their resolution. Can we have pie? Noah said, without looking up from his plate. It wasn't really a question. Lily said, I know. Eleanor looked at Wyatt. Wyatt looked at Eleanor. Something passed between them. Not a look exactly, more a shared acknowledgement of the room they were sitting in and the 4 people in it and the distance between now and the train platform 14 months ago. There's pie, Eleanor said. Dalt brought apples from the Patterson orchard this morning. He's sweet on the Patterson girl, Noah said, still looking at his plate. Noah, Wyatt said, it's true. Most true things don't require saying at supper. Noah looked up and his mouth did something that was almost a smile before he controlled it, and Lily laughed, and Eleanor got up to cut the pie, and the kitchen held all of them in the particular way that kitchens hold people when they have become, without anyone declaring it, a family. The letter she had not expected came in August, near the end of the month, when the heat had begun to ease and the grass had gone the color of old gold. It was from her father. Not through Granger, not through attorneys. His own handwriting this time. She recognized it immediately. The careful, slightly rigid script of a man who had excellent penmanship because he had been taught to, and who took pride in things he'd been taught to take pride in. It was 2 pages. She read them alone at her desk. He did not apologize. She had not expected him to. Aldrich Voss was not a man built for direct apology. The architecture wasn't there, and she had made her peace with that somewhere around year 26 of being his daughter. What he did instead was describe, in his precise and formal way, certain things he had observed during his 2 days in Red Hollow. He described the house and the garden and the way the children spoke to her. He described watching her from a distance. She hadn't known he'd done this. Moving through the yard, talking to the ranch hand with the gray beard, gesturing toward the garden with the ease of someone describing something she'd built. He said he didn't understand it. He said he meant the life she'd made, not the chair, though she suspected the distinction was more recent than it sounded. He said that he had believed for a long time that his concern for her was the same as her well-being, and that he was beginning to understand these were not identical, though he found the distinction uncomfortable. He did not say he had been wrong, but the letter was the closest he had come to it in 32 years, and Eleanor sat with it for a long time. She thought about this version of herself that had sat on that train 14 months ago with a borrowed ticket and a different name, terrified and absolutely certain and completely alone. She thought about what that woman had wanted from her father, which was not an apology. Apology was too late and too small, but something more like recognition. To be seen as a person who was determining her own life rather than a situation that required management. She didn't know if her father could fully see that. She thought maybe he was beginning to look in the right direction, which was different, and which would have to be enough. She wrote back. It took her 3 drafts. The final version was a page and a half, and it did not invite him to visit, and it did not forgive anything specifically, because specific forgiveness required specific acknowledgement, and he hadn't provided that yet. But it left the door at a particular angle, not open, not closed, angled, the way you'd leave a door when you weren't sure yet whether you wanted the air or the privacy, and you needed time to find out. She sealed it and gave it to Greer for the post and went back to the accounts, and didn't think about it again that afternoon, because the accounts required attention, and the afternoon was short, and there were things she could do something about, and things she couldn't, and she had gotten good at knowing which was which. Fall arrived, and with it the particular business of a ranch preparing for winter, which was a different kind of work than summer. Denser, more anticipatory, work done against a deadline that the weather set without negotiation. Eleanor had been through one Montana winter and knew what was coming, and she had been organizing for it since September, with the methodical attention she brought to anything where the cost of being underprepared was paid in cold. The bulk order from Helena had arrived in early September, the second one now, since she'd established the arrangement, and this time Holt & Billings had identified a second supplier who came in lower on the wire, So the fence repair that had been deferred twice was finally scheduled. She had negotiated the terms herself, by letter, over 3 weeks of back and forth that Wyatt had watched with something between amusement and genuine respect. "You enjoy this," he said once, watching her read the latest supply letter. "I enjoy problems that can be solved with information and persistence," she said. "Most supply negotiations are exactly that." "Is that all of them?" "Most of them. Some vendors are simply stubborn beyond reason, and you have to decide if the price is worth the stubbornness." "Hargrove," Wyatt said. "Hargrove," she confirmed. "But he's come down 15% since the first conversation, and he knows I have the Helena numbers, so the stubbornness is diminishing." Wyatt shook his head slowly. Not in displeasure. In the expression of a man watching something operate and finding it genuinely impressive. "What?" she said. "I paid full price to Hargrove for 6 years," he said. "You had other things to think about," she said. "You were keeping people alive. That takes a different kind of attention." "So does this." "Yes," she said. "But it's the kind I happen to be good at." He looked at her for a moment. "You're good at more than one kind." She turned back to the letter. But she heard him. "What?" Noah turned 15 in October. He had grown 2 inches since Eleanor arrived, and his voice had finished the transition. It had been in the middle of when she came, and he was becoming, with the daily visibility of teenagers, someone distinct and specific and interesting. He had a mind that was good at structure, at seeing how things connected, how a change in one part of a system moved through to other parts. And Eleanor had been feeding this with increasing precision, moving him from geometry into surveying principles and then into the basics of land assessment, because she had a theory about what he was going to be good at, and she was testing it. The day he turned 50, she gave him a surveying manual she had ordered from Helena 6 weeks earlier. It was a professional manual, not a student text, and when he opened it, he looked at her. "This is a real one," he said. "You're ready for a real one," she said. He turned through the first pages. His expression was doing the complicated thing it did when he was moved by something and was 14, 15, and had absolutely no mechanism for showing it that didn't feel dangerous. "Thank you," he said, very quietly. "To the book, mostly." "When the ground is right in spring," Eleanor said, "we'll do a practical survey of the east boundary. There's a question about the line between the Callahan spread and the Patterson property that's been unresolved since your grandfather's time. A proper survey settles it." He looked up. "That's a real problem." "Everything worth learning is," she said. "I went to his room with the manual and she heard him up late that night because there was a line of light under his door when she passed at 11. And she didn't say anything about it because there were worse things a 15-year-old could be doing late at night than reading a surveying manual. Lily, meanwhile, had progressed through 4 more books since the Adams biography and had developed strong and frequently expressed opinions about historical figures that she delivered at supper without being asked. Wyatt had initially received these opinions with the polite bewilderment of a man who had not thought much about Abigail Adams, and had moved by October into something more like genuine engagement, occasionally pushing back on Lily's conclusions in ways that generated arguments that lasted into the evening and that Eleanor listened to from across the room with a satisfaction she kept to herself. One night Wyatt said to Eleanor after the children had gone to bed, "She's going to be something." "She already is something," Eleanor said. "She just needs room to find out what." "She gets that from you." Eleanor shook her head. "She gets it from herself. I'm just not in the way of it." Wyatt was quiet for a moment. The stove ticked in the way of stoves in fall when the temperature outside was dropping. "Most people would take the credit," he said. "Most people are wrong about where credit belongs," she said. He looked at her across the table, the same table where they'd first gone through the accounts together, where he'd pushed the ledger toward her and she'd bent over the numbers in the lamplight and something had quietly begun. "I want to tell you something," he said. She waited. "When the train was late that day on the platform," he said slowly, "I was standing there thinking about sending her back, before I'd even seen her. I was standing there and I was thinking, if this doesn't work, I can send her back and no one will blame me and I can just keep going the way I've been going." He turned his cup. "And then I saw the chair and I thought, this is the reason. This is the reason to send her back that everyone will accept, that nobody will question." Eleanor held very still. "And then I walked over," he said, "because I'd been standing on that platform looking for permission to give up on something I hadn't tried yet, and that felt—" He stopped. That felt like the most tired thing I'd ever almost done. The kitchen was quiet. The lamp was low. What changed? She asked. Nothing changed, he said. I just noticed what I was doing. He set down the cup. You said something on the wagon about how people convince themselves they're being kind when they're giving up on something that would cost them. I thought about that for a long time. I said it about my father, she said. I know, but it fit other things. Eleanor looked at him, at the face she had been reading for 14 months, the jaw that tightened when he was deciding something, the way his eyes went a particular shade of careful when he was worried about one of the children, the expression he got when he was about to say something he'd been working up to for a while. I'm glad you walked over, she said. So am I, he said. I'm glad every day. This was, from Wyatt Callahan, the equivalent of a speech. Eleanor received it as such. The winter came in November, and it was hard, the way Montana winters were hard, without apology and without regard for readiness. The preparatory work paid off. The cellar was full, the fence was replaced, the bulk order was stacked and inventoried. But hard winters found their weaknesses regardless of preparation, and the weakness this winter found was the main stove's flue, which had a crack that hadn't been visible in fall and became very visible in January when it started drawing badly and smoking the kitchen. Wyatt and Greer spent 4 days dealing with it, which involved taking the flue apart in sections and temperatures that Eleanor would not have chosen to work outdoors in. And the kitchen was cold and the cooking was improvised and the house smelled of smoke in an unpleasant way for most of those 4 days. Eleanor managed. She moved the cooking to the smaller stove in the back room, which was not designed for what she was doing with it, but which cooperated adequately. She kept the children in the main room where the secondary heat source was functioning, and she kept the meals continuous and the temperature in the occupied rooms above uncomfortable. And on the 4th night, when the flue repair was finished and the main stove roared back to proper function, she made the largest pot of soup she had ever made and put biscuits in the oven and called everyone in. Greer sat at the kitchen table with his hands around a bowl and said, I've been on this ranch 8 years, and I don't think it's ever smelled this good. You're cold and you're hungry, Eleanor said. Everything smells good when you're cold and hungry. That's true, he said, but this is better than usual, even accounting for that. Dalt agreed at some length in the way Dalt agreed with things, with more enthusiasm than specificity, but with complete sincerity. Noah ate 3 bowls. He said nothing about it, which was his particular form of endorsement. That night, when it was quiet and the stove was running clean and the house had recovered its warmth, Wyatt sat beside Eleanor at the table and looked at the repaired stove and said, 4 days. 4 days, she agreed. You didn't lose your temper once. She thought about this. I lost it once, she said. When the smaller stove wouldn't hold temperature on the second morning, I swore at it. The stove deserved it, he said. Probably. She picked up her coffee. Wyatt, I want to talk to you about something. He turned slightly. The wagon, she said. The standard one isn't good for the north pasture. The ruts in spring make it nearly impossible for me to get any useful distance without someone driving, which means I'm dependent on when someone else is available. She kept her voice practical, because this was a practical conversation. I've been thinking about what you'd need to modify. Wider wheelbase for stability, lower center for the step, a proper brace for the chair so it doesn't have to be dismantled and reassembled every time. He was listening with his full attention. I drew some ideas, she said. She slid a folded paper across the table. I'm not an engineer, but the principle is straightforward. He unfolded the paper and looked at her drawings, which were functional rather than elegant. She drew the way she did most things, for accuracy rather than appearance. He turned the paper slightly, studying it. He asked 2 questions about the brace mechanism. She answered them. Greer's brother does wagon work in Billings, Wyatt said. He's good. Can he work from drawings? With some discussion, yes. Then let's write to him in spring, she said. He looked at the drawings again. This would let you get to the north pasture alone. That's the point, she said. He folded the paper carefully and kept it. We'll write in March, he said. Before the thaw. She nodded. It was a small thing in the ledger of large and small things that had accumulated over the past year and a half, but it was hers in a way that mattered. Not accommodation given to her, but a solution she had designed and proposed and would execute through her own request. The distinction was everything. Spring came slowly, the way it did, and the East Boundary Survey was on Noah's calendar from the first clear week. He had spent the winter with the surveying manual and had done 2 of the practice exercises Eleanor had constructed for him using the ranch's own records. And in April, when the ground was right, they went out, Noah and Eleanor and Wyatt, with the equipment that Holt and Billings had helped them procure on Eleanor's instructions. The East Boundary question had been in the Callahan records since the grandfather's time. The line between Callahan land and Patterson land was notated in 2 different places in 2 different documents with a discrepancy of approximately 40 yards, and nobody had ever formally resolved it because nobody had had a reason sufficient to justify the cost of a proper survey. Noah had read both documents over the winter and had theories. His theories were largely correct. It took 2 days of work, with Noah leading the measurements and Eleanor managing the documentation and Wyatt doing the physical marking. The discrepancy turned out to originate in a recording error from a land transfer in 1861, and the resolution actually gave the Callahan spread 11 yards more than the more conservative of the 2 notations, which was not a large amount, but was a clear amount. On the second afternoon, coming back along the east fence, Noah was quiet in a particular way. Not the old quiet, the weighted silence he'd carried when Eleanor first arrived, but the quiet of someone processing something new. "You knew it was there," he said finally to Eleanor. "I suspected there was an error," she said. "I didn't know which direction it fell." "But you knew it could be fixed." "Most things can be," she said. "If you're willing to go back to the original document and look at what it actually says instead of what everyone decided it said." He walked beside the wagon for a moment. "Is that a general thing?" "Generally, yes, though it applies more cleanly to surveying than to some other matters." He considered this. "Like with my mother." She looked at him. "Going back to what actually happened," he said, "instead of the story I'd been telling myself about it." Eleanor was quiet for a moment. "Yes," she said. "Like that." He nodded once. He moved ahead to help Wyatt with the fence marker, and Eleanor watched him go. The height he'd reached, the particular way he moved across difficult ground, confident and careful in equal measure. And she thought about the boy who had said, "I don't need school," and had meant, "I don't know how to need anything safely," and about all the ground between that day and this one. The wagon modified letter went to Greer's brother in Billings in March as planned, and the wagon came back in June. It was lower and wider and had the brace she had designed, and Greer's brother had added a detail she hadn't thought of: a small mounted box on the left side for tools and papers, sized for her reach from the chair. She took it out alone the first time, on a clear morning when Wyatt was in the south pasture with Dalt and the children were at their lessons. She went north, on the track that had always been too rutted for the old wagon when she was alone, and the wider wheels distributed across the ruts the way she had calculated they would. And she reached the upper pasture gate without difficulty and sat there for a while looking at the land. The Callahan spread ran a long way from where she sat. She could see the south fence line from here, and the roof of the barn, and if the air was clear enough, she could see the chimney smoke from the house. It was all of it, laid out in front of her, the thing they were building. She had come here in a wheelchair on a train platform while an entire town went quiet, and a woman who wanted her gone had said, loudly enough for everyone to hear, that she was a charity case. She had come with a different name and a letter she hadn't answered, and 8 years of learning to live at a different angle, and no certainty at all about what waited for her here. What waited for her here had been this. Not a story about overcoming, not a lesson in perseverance delivered from a distance. Just this. The specific, unglamorous, continuously demanding work of building a life alongside people who became, without announcement, the people she would not trade. She sat at the upper pasture gate for a while. The sky was the particular blue of Montana in early summer, the kind that looked slightly unreal until you'd seen enough of it to know it was just what the sky looked like here. A hawk turned in wide circles over the north slope, patient and absolute in the way of things that know exactly what they're doing. She thought about her father's letter. She had written to him twice since August, and he had written back both times, and the correspondence was careful and incomplete, and nothing like what she might have wished for when she was 20, but it was something that hadn't existed before, and she was learning that something was worth maintaining even when it fell short of what you'd wanted. That was its own kind of maturity, to take what was real over what was wished for, and to find the real thing sufficient without pretending it was more. She thought about Mabel Crowley, who had been at the spring community meeting 3 weeks ago, and had nodded to Eleanor across the room. Not warmly, but without hostility, which was the version of resolution available to them and which Eleanor accepted as such, because she was not someone who required her adversaries to become her admirers. She required only that they get out of the way, and Mabel Crowley had, eventually, gotten out of the way. She thought about Greer and his biscuit recipe and Dalt's ongoing courtship of the Patterson girl, which had progressed to the point where the Pattersons had invited him to supper twice, and about Mrs. Patton, who had come to the wedding with a covered dish and had become, in the way of such things, a fixture at the edges of their life in town. She thought about Lily, who was 10 now and reading at a level that would embarrass most adults, and who had recently informed Eleanor that she wanted to be a lawyer because lawyers, and here Lily had quoted Eleanor back to her from a conversation 3 months prior, were the people who could use the actual words in the actual document to settle questions that everyone else was just guessing about. Eleanor had not remembered saying this. It did sound like her. She thought about Noah with the surveying manual, Noah who had been silent and rigid and carrying 3 years of guilt when she arrived, who was 15 and confident and still not easy, still worked in the particular way that people who have carried something heavy continue to work even after they've put it down, with a gravity, a deliberateness, that the carrying had shaped into them, and that was not a flaw but a characteristic, something that would make him formidable at whatever he decided to do with it. The hawk came lower on its spiral. The cattle moved in the upper pasture behind the gate, slow and purposeful in the way of cattle. Eleanor Callahan. The name was still new enough that she was sometimes briefly startled by it in documents, before the recognition caught up, sat in her modified wagon at the gate of the upper pasture and let the morning be what it was. She was 33 years old. She had been in a wheelchair for 9 years. She had run away from a life that was managing her and arrived in a place that didn't know what to do with her and had built, through the application of consistent attention and the willingness to be honest about hard things, something that held. It was not a perfect thing. It was not supposed to be. Perfect things were, in her experience, either not real or not worth having, and she had stopped wanting them sometime around year 3 with the chair, when she had understood that the work of living was not the work of getting to a place where nothing was hard, but the work of becoming someone for whom the hard things didn't determine the outcome. That was the thing nobody told you. They told you to be brave, to be strong, to persevere. What they didn't tell you was that bravery, actual bravery, was mostly organizational. It was mostly the decision, made quietly and alone and usually more than once, to continue doing the next thing, to stay in the room when leaving was available, to open the letter instead of setting it on the table, to tell the man beside you on the wagon the true thing instead of the managing thing, to get on the train. She turned the wagon back toward the house. The ruts cooperated. The wider wheels held their line across the difficult sections, the way they were designed to, and she came down the north track at a reasonable speed with the June light on the grass and the smoke from the house chimney rising straight in the still morning air. Wyatt was at the yard fence when she came in. He had come back from the south pasture earlier than expected, apparently, or had been watching for the wagon's return. She didn't ask which, because she knew the answer and knew that acknowledging it would make him find somewhere else to be, and she preferred him here. He opened the yard gate for her. Not because she needed it opened, she had been opening gates for herself for 9 years, but because it was the closest thing to a ceremony available to this particular moment. And Wyatt Callahan was, under the practical exterior, a man who understood that some moments deserved ceremony even when you couldn't name what kind. She came through the gate and stopped beside him. "How did it handle?" he asked, meaning the wagon. "Well," she said, "better than I projected, actually. The brace held through the north ruts without any adjustment." He nodded. He looked at the wagon for a moment, at the toolbox on the left side that Greer's brother had added, at the wider wheelbase and the lower step. "You're going to want to go further next time," he said. "Yes," she said. "I thought so." He wasn't bothered by this. He said it the way he said most things, as a fact he was making room for. The Patterson boundary is about 2 miles past the upper gate. Noah thinks there might be a similar recording issue up there. "He's probably right," Eleanor said. "He usually is when he's thought about something that long." "Spring survey next year? Put it on the calendar." Wyatt looked at her, in the way he'd been looking at her for almost a year and a half now. Not the assessing look of the train platform, not the careful look of the trial month, but the particular look of a man who has run out of surprises at the good kind and has simply decided to live in the vicinity of it. She looked back at him the same way. "Noah's at the south fence," he said. "Lily's inside complaining about the spelling exercise." "The spelling exercise is deliberately unreasonable," Eleanor said, starting toward the house. "It's designed to make her argue about it. The arguing is the lesson." She heard him laugh, a short and genuine sound behind her. She did not turn around, but she heard it, and it was one of the ordinary things that accumulated, one after another, into a life she recognized as hers. Inside, Lily was at the table with the spelling work and the specific expression of a child who has identified an injustice and is prepared to present her findings. Eleanor came through the door and Lily looked up. "These rules don't make any sense," Lily said. "No," Eleanor agreed, settling herself at the table. "They don't. Tell me which ones you think are worst," Lily told her, in considerable detail. The kitchen was warm and the stove was functioning correctly, and outside the June morning was doing what June mornings in Montana do, which is to be extravagantly alive in a way that required no commentary. This was what it looked like. Not the version people told afterward, smoothed and resolved. All the difficult parts recounted from a safe distance where they had already been survived. The version that was actually happening, continuously, with its freight of ordinary friction and unfinished business, and people who were becoming themselves in real time and who required not heroism, but presence. Eleanor Callahan was present. She had been present every morning for 14 months, at the table where the ledgers were, and at the stove where things sometimes spilled, and at the window where the Montana sky did what it did, and in the yard where the garden was growing its practical herbs in the rocky soil, and at the upper pasture gate where the land ran long and clear in every direction. She was not done. There was no done. There was only the next morning and the work it contained, and the people she would do it alongside, and the continuing fact of a life that was, in all the ways that counted, genuinely her own. Lily finished her accounting of unreasonable spelling rules and looked at Eleanor expectantly. "You're right about most of them," Eleanor said. "Now tell me which words you actually need to spell correctly for the rest of your life, and we'll start there." Lily picked up her pencil. Outside, Noah was coming back across the yard from the south fence, his surveying manual under his arm, already thinking about whatever problem he was working through. Wyatt was somewhere in the outbuildings, doing the next thing. The ranch went on around them. The morning went on. The life they had built together, imperfect and ongoing and entirely real, held them all inside it like a piece of ground that had been properly surveyed. Boundaries known, errors corrected, every inch belonging to someone who had earned it.